Interested in seeing bold online personalities tackle real challenges? Stay tuned as these misguided figures are destroying men and women.
Incoming freshmen next year, University of Toronto, Stanford University, 18-year-old kids. Coming into this, we've been through 3 years of COVID. I won't rehearse it all. One sentence, what would you say to them as they begin university at the age of 18 or 19? What's the restorative, the redemptive sentence? What should they do?
Don't be thinking your ambition is corrupt. You know, because that's part of the message now. Human beings, we're a cancer on the planet. We're headed for an environmental apocalypse. The entire historical structure is nothing but atrocity, etc., etc. Anyone with any ethical aim whatsoever is just going to pull back. You don't want to manifest any ambition, support the patriarchal structure, exploit the environment. You've got to crush yourself down. You shouldn't even have any children. It's like, no. There's no excuse for that. There's zero excuse for that. I saw a professor at an event, something like this. He came out and trumpeted this bloody, environmentally friendly house he'd built. And, you know, fair enough, man. It was a pretty interesting house. But not everybody had the $4 million that it took him to build it. And I'm not criticizing his money even. It's like, he's had some money. Good for him. He built a house. Okay. But then to trumpet that as a moral virtue, well, you're pushing it there. And then he came out to all the kids and he said, you know, my wife and I decided that we were only going to have one child. And I think that's one of the most ethical things we could have possibly done. And I would strongly encourage you to do the same. I thought, you son of a bitch. You get up in front of these young people. A lot of these kids were children of first-generation immigrants from China. And he showed all these images, you know, of these terrible factories in China, these endless rows of sterile mechanism that were subordinating all the Chinese people to this terrible, you know, capitalist machine.
In this speech, Jordan Peterson criticizes the message being spread to young people, particularly by a professor who promoted environmental restraint and discouraged having more than one child as an ethical choice. Peterson calls out the demoralizing nature of these teachings, arguing that telling students they are inherently corrupt or that ambition is wrong is harmful.
And I thought, you don't understand. Half the audience is looking at those factories and thinking, that's a hell of a lot better than struggling through the mud under Mao, buddy. And so, I don't know where he thought he was, but to come out in front of all those kids and basically tell them that the whole human enterprise is so goddamn corrupt that the best thing they could possibly do is limit their multiplication, and to think of himself as a scholar and an educator, it was just, I did say something, by the way. It was rather uncomfortable, and he stomped off the stage. But that's no message for young people. There's no excuse for that. And you think, well, you know, we're going to destroy the planet. We have to do this. We have to demoralize the youth to be ethical. It's like, yeah, really, that's your theory? You're going to demoralize young people to be ethical? That's your theory? It's like, you should go home and think about that for like a year. And I'm passionate about this, you know, because you have no idea how many people that's killing. You have no idea. I see people everywhere, all over the world. They're so demoralized, especially young people with a conscience, because they've been told since they were little that there's nothing to them but corruption and power. It's like, how the hell do you expect them to react? You know, well, I shouldn't do anything then, you know.
Dr. Jordan Peterson on what was the phrase? The divine sovereign individual. The divine sovereign individual. Thank you.
He emphasizes that young people, especially those with a conscience, are being crushed under this narrative. He passionately states that such ideas are no solution and instead cause immense harm, leaving young people feeling powerless and without purpose.
This is why, it's funny because I think that, you know, the issue that you started to become really politically prominent on, which is the Bill C-16 in Ontario and
Canada, it was federal law.
In Canada, the gender issue.
Yeah.
You know, that's the issue where now the question that's constantly being asked, so why do you even care? Why do you even pay attention? And the answer is because...
I was asked that earlier today.
Oh, really? What did you say?
I'm not letting the cat have my tongue.
Yeah.
It's like it has nothing to do with gender as far as I'm concerned, or that's peripheral in some sense. So the accusation, why do you care? Fair enough. It's like, you know, in some way, people can go to hell in a handbasket if they're inclined to. Mm-hmm. Now, I would rather have that not happen, but people are, what would you say, doomed to their own autonomy. But I'm not saying words that other people want me to say. And the idea of compelled speech, it's like the bill was this much about gender.
Right.
And it was this much
that's
about,
right.
oh yeah, the government's going to tell me what to say, hey.
But
now they're regulating what therapists can say, therapy sessions.
This is interesting because to me, the problem with a lot of this is less a free speech issue, even though I'm on the same page with you. And to me, it really is a fundamental truth issue. Meaning that, yeah, you're trying to force me to say something I don't want to say, but to me, the fact that what you're trying to force me to say is so innately opposed to the good is the problem. Like you could try. I would have objections to you forcing me to say that I like a particular movie, right? It may not be true. I don't like the particular movie. It would be bad if you tried to force me to say that. But the level of passion that I have for issues like this one really go to the fact that I think the fundamental good of humanity relies on basic acknowledgments of biological truth, especially when it comes to gender. And anybody who's ever dealt with children, I find myself getting. If I look at my own political evolution, I'd say that when I grew up in a religious home, so that means that pretty conservative. And then you go to college and you're living by yourself and you're not married, you don't have kids. You tend to become a little bit more libertarian, which is like, okay, let everybody do whatever they're going to do and it's not going to bother me. And then you have kids and you realize that there's a pool in which we are all swimming.
Jordan Peterson has voiced strong opinions on transgenderism, particularly concerning the issue of compelled speech and Bill C-16 in Canada. His opposition to this bill stemmed from his belief that it infringed on free speech by requiring people to use specific gender pronouns. Peterson argues that this debate is not merely about gender, but about the government's attempt to control language and speech.
And that pool is going to define...
Virginia.
Exactly. Like my kid, it's going to determine how my kid lives. And I want my community to reflect some of my values because I don't want my kid to live in the toxic sludge that you are creating for my kid. I don't want you indoctrinating my kids in bullshit about whether
yes, exactly.
a boy can be a girl or a girl can be a
People will
girl.
say, well, I'll exceed, but not for my children.
Yeah.
And that's what Virginia demonstrated. It's like, you can come after me, but you come after my kids, and that's a whole different story.
It's so fundamentally opposed to everything true, and the fact that that's the insistence. The insistence isn't that people be treated humanely or be treated decently. The insistence is that your vision of yourself be reflected by me in defiance of baseline reality and in order to redefine how society as a whole works.
Well, a lot of it's murky thinking. If someone asked me, do I believe that there are gender fluid people? I would say yes. And I would say a young man who's gender fluid, I know what he's like temperamentally. He's high in agreeableness. He's high in neuroticism. So he has a feminine temperament. He's more interested in people than things. And he's extremely high in openness. And so his temperament is fluid. He's creative, and so he's one thing one day and one thing the next. And his fundamental temperament is tilted towards the feminine. But that doesn't mean he's not a man.
Right, exactly.
So it's murky thinking.
That's exactly right.
It's certainly the case that 1 out of 10 women, now it depends on where you put the cutoff, say, but you could say with reasonable certainty that 1 in 10 women has a masculine temperament and 1 in 10 men has a feminine temperament. And so that's a lot of people. And those people, especially if they're also creative, well, they're kind of at a loss in relationship to what to do with their identity because they're pulled. First of all, they have a hard time catalyzing their identity. Creative people have a hard time catalyzing it. It's like the definition of creativity. They're protean. And so there have been people who play at the edges of gender identity forever. And fair enough. And sometimes that's even admirable if it's done in a sophisticated way. And it's charismatic. So you see it in Mick Jagger, you see it in David Bowie, you see it in people like Madonna as well, because Madonna had a hard edge, that was very masculine. And all the Marvel superhero women have a hard masculine edge. And so we find that charismatic because those people are also integrated. But the notion that there's such a thing as gender, that's not right. There's variability in personality and temperament. And the idea that there's no such thing as biological sex, that's just insane.
It's insanity. They've abstracted gender from sex and then read gender back into sex as more important than sex. It's
well, and then why insist upon the biological modifications?
Right.
If there's no such thing as sex, it's like, well, then just act out your role.
Right.
Leave your body alone because it's irrelevant anyways. Well, it turns out it's not irrelevant. You have to go through the surgical transformation, which is a pretty dramatic answer to a question that for 99% of people who are ambivalent about their gender identity would be best solved without surgical intervention.
Yep.
And then so now in Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy.
Right.
There's no such thing as affirmation therapy.
Right. No, it's insane. I mean, the semantic game that was used in order to say, well, conversion therapy.
He also emphasizes the importance of biological truths, particularly when it comes to gender. While he acknowledges that some individuals have fluid temperaments or personalities, Peterson insists that biological sex and gender are distinct and should not be conflated. For him, the real issue lies in the erosion of free expression and the societal pressure to conform to ideologies that challenge established truths about gender and sex.
So I define, for example, woke. One sentence definition, people always ask, what is the definition of woke? Well, the definition of woke, as I mentioned in the book, is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's it. That's the one sentence definition. And that is also what I would say, what I would describe as the kind of big bang of our moral order. And out of that emerges a kind of very fuzzy folk ideology, which says, so these are the sacred groups. Those groups cannot be offended. So anything you say that might be interpreted by the most sensitive member of such a group as offensive marks you out as a blasphemer. You're profaning the sacred, you must be excommunicated, i.e. canceled. The other part of this is absolute equality in terms of prestigious positions and resources between these groups. So, for example, you can't have a race gap or a gender gap in terms of the boardroom, in terms of admittance to elite universities and so on. It's got to be zero. So equality plus emotional safety. These are the two pillars of this ideology. But the point I make is this ideology is not some kind of system like Lockean liberalism or even Marxism that is, it is more of a bottom-up empathizing rather than a top-down systematizing cognitive thing. It's much more emotional. We're attached concretely to the Black civil rights movement, to the indigenous, to the LGBT movements, and it's our romanticization and sympathy for these concrete groups that provides our meaning, and that's primary in the system. It's not a set of ideas like Marxism. It's actually a set of emotional attachments. And so this is very much emotional, and it's driven from the ground up.
Jordan Peterson defines woke culture as the act of treating historically marginalized groups, such as those based on race, gender, and sexual identity, as sacred.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about that. Okay, so I guess you pulled out two strings there. You did associate the system of ideas with liberal progressivism, let's say starting in the early 20th century. But then you were also stressing the more emotional side of it. Let's call it the compassionate side. So I want to ask you, and you talked about it as bottom-up and emotion-driven. So it seems to me that there's the analysis of the woke phenomena has revealed a number of potentially fundamental causal elements. You pointed to liberal progressivism and compassion and the role of emotion, let's say. Other people have pointed to the role of like a kind of a meta-Marxism. So it's the Marxists, of course, divided the world into victim and victimizer, essentially on economic grounds. The difference now is that same narrative seems to play out. There are victims and there are victimizers, but there is a number of dimensions along which that axis of inequality can reveal itself. And you talked about race, gender, and sexuality. Oh, there's other axes as well, but those are likely the primary ones. And then with regards to the emotional side, this is something I can't help wondering about, and no one is talking about it, and I can understand why. We did a series of studies that were published in 2016, which was pretty much when I left the university, so it never got completed. But we identified a group of ideas that hung together statistically that we called politically correct authoritarianism, deviated to some degree from, say, the liberal progressivist ethos, in that the people who adopted the set of ideas were perfectly willing to use compulsion and force, that being perhaps the primary distinction. The predictors that we found that determined whether or not people adopted those beliefs were, first of all, low verbal intelligence. That was a walloping predictor. And the second one was being female. And the third one was having a female temperament. And the fourth one was having ever taken even one politically correct course. And so one of the things I'm very curious about, see, I've been thinking that one of the things that we're seeing is the increased female domination of the university system, especially in the humanities and the social sciences. And I think there's a fundamental feminine ethos that's instinctive, that can be made more sophisticated with genuine education, but that has a proclivity to divide the world up into predators and infants. And woe betide you if you happen to fall into the predator camp. It's very tightly allied with the victim-victimizer narrative. And, you know, you do point out in your book that there is a predilection for women between the ages of 18 and 34, and this has been shown everywhere.
This means that any offense perceived by members of these groups is considered a violation of societal norms, often leading to the cancellation of the person responsible. Peterson also explains that woke culture promotes absolute equality in terms of resources and prestigious positions, such as in boardrooms or universities. He sees it as driven by emotional attachment to these groups rather than a structured ideology like Marxism.